Class, for this lecture, we are going to look at mood disorders. And looking at mood disorders, it's important that we start by looking at the difference between emotions and mood. So, what's the difference there? We have bad emotions, we have negative moods that make us feel angry, and moods actually are more complicated than emotions in the sense that moods can be a long term feeling, whereas emotions are fleeting. Say you stub your toe, it hurts, maybe it makes you mad, but then it goes away. Something like an emotion like sadness that is endearing and persistent, and no matter what you do, you just can't shake those those thoughts, those feelings. That's more of a mood. So mood is more a state of mind. And once again, emotions are something that we constantly experience, and they're constantly changing, especially during adolescence, where we can go from happy, sad, angry, whatever, in like the blink of an eye, right? You guys who have teenagers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's just all hormones and those neurotransmitters that are still developing while we are in adolescence. And they play a main role in how our brains get sick, and how things like our the emotional parts of our brains, that mood state we can get in, how those can get fixed, and then how we can, how those can get sick, and we can go about, fixing them. And in fixing them, what that simply means is that as human beings, we all have the right to be here and experience this earth and live on this earth. And, we shouldn't have to, stress is going to come at us. Things are going to make us mad. Things are going to make us angry. But, emotions are just a part of who we are in our human experience. They don't define us. And when we get into these more negative states, there are ways that we can learn to deal with the stress and the negativity in life, so that we don't let those negative states overwhelm us and hinder us. And, it's not about being all Susie Sunshine, life's all unicorn and rainbows. It's not. But, we can definitely feel better about ourselves and create more of the world the way that we want to live when we stay more in, healthy, positive, productive states of being, mind, body, soul, spirit. All right. So when it comes to mood disorders, depression is the major disorder there. And it is actually the most common psychiatric disorder here in the United States. When it comes to globally, we see it is the second leading cause. And I think if depression, I want to say that maybe suicide might be suicidal tendencies, or if not, maybe it's schizophrenia. I forgot to look that up. But depression and mood disorders are the second worldwide. A study seemed to note that women seem to be at greater risk for developing depression than men. And it seems more of a cultural factor there, in that, women are taught to be more emotionally expressive. Women are taught to talk things out when they have problems, whereas men, culturally, especially here in the United States, we're a patriarchal society. Men are supposed to be masculine. They can't show any type of emotional expression, even though, men have just the same emotional range as women do. But, men, we're taught to display emotions in a different way. So it may not be that women are at a greater risk. It may just be that as that women are kind of maybe a little more self-aware when it comes to emotional states, because of the way we have been taught and raised in our culture. So it's just that more women seek treatment for it than men, whereas maybe, that men get it just as much as women, but they're taught to hide it. And I think maybe it also is displayed differently in men. Domestic abuse, that is definitely a sign of a mental disorder. And it would be probably very shocking to you to know the number of women that are being emotionally, verbally, financially, whatever, abused by their husbands, and just don't talk about it here in Tennessee. That's a big deal because they're like number 4 in the country for domestic abuse that leads to the man killing his wife. So they that and sex trafficking actually is another thing that they talk a lot about on the news. So that's something else that, of course, a mood, people are going to develop mood disorders. And then, for men too, I think maybe men substitute with things like drugs and alcohol and like I said, possibly violence. But, that's just a hypothesis. That theory is yet to be tested. All right. And so, Mm. When it comes to looking at the statistics, depression, we all get sad. We actually get sad and depressed. There's a lot of stigma around depression disorder because, I'm sure we all know somebody who maybe be what do they call it, a Debbie Downer. And, sometimes there are other mental disorders going on. A lot of mental disorders are what we call comorbid. So it means like you don't just have one, you can have more than one. So, maybe sometimes there are more of those melodramatic personality disorders involved. And then, there are serious cases of depression and people don't identify those signs early enough, and then sadly that individual does commit suicide. And that actually is a pretty high statistic for the rate of suicide. It's in the top 5 um ways that people die in a year, and the most let's see, the top 3 fields people commit suicide, like law enforcement, EMT. What's the other one? They're all high risk. So law enforcement, EMT, psychologist. How could I forget that? Sadly, a lot of people who deal in the mental health field fall victim to mental illness themselves. And what is the other one? I can't remember the other one, but think like high stress jobs. And then it seems that a lot of people, when it comes to having signs of depression, that there doesn't really seem to be any reduction in the symptoms until you got to find that right treatment combination. But if left alone, it actually has a spiraling effect, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So when it comes to mental disorders and mental illnesses, let's address that real quickly. So a mental disorder, mental illness, what's the difference there? There's really not, guys. It's just different words for the same type of things. You have to think when it comes to mental disorder, when it comes to treating mental illness, as psychologists, we take in a holistic approach, and we'll talk about that in the second half of our video, the multi-path model of treatment and understanding mental disorders. But basically, we're looking at all the factors and how they all interplay and relate to each other. So when it comes to looking at mental disorders, we break them down into various categories. Then within, so, like main categories: mood disorder, personality disorder, anxiety disorder, eating disorder. And so as that we've already seen in class, then we break those main groups down into smaller subcategories. And so when it comes to organizing the mood disorder into these smaller categories, once again, like I just mentioned, there's a spiral effect. So, there are kind of a little bit of, let's say, different factors that are going on as far as how severe, severe and debilitating, the the mental illness is. You know, how sick has the brain gotten? So we look at psychotic versus neurotic dimensions. We look at that unipolar versus bipolar dimension. And then, especially with depression, we're going to look at those exogenous and those endogenous explanations. We're going to look at whether they're cyclomatic, if they're, I'm not going to say that, diastylomatic, something like that. Whereas if they're more severe, more acute, you know, then you have major depression. That's when you start getting into bipolar disorders. And, you know, once again, these are, mental disorders fall in a spectrum. And when we get to that most extreme severe end, this is where we see the most debilitation. You know, these are where the people are going to act the most out of character, and you know that's very harmful to themselves and pretty much others. At times, you know, it's not to say that all people with mental disorders on the severe level are actually intent to harm others, but definitely, you know, there's a little inhibition there to maybe to harm themselves, most definitely. And of course, as psychologists, our main goal is to help everybody and to, you know, make everybody safe. So, you know, we can all try to get along the best we can, right? And then finally, you know, once again, we're going to look at if the mood disorders are primary or if they're secondary. And so primary, if it stands on its own, or if it's the word I mentioned before, comorbid, which means that it's got, or concomitant, which means that it is sharing, it's you know, more than one type of disorder going on there. And that's important to know because once again, when it comes down to treatment, and you really want to be specific with that, especially when you get into the biopsychological side of it. And, you know, we start handing out prescriptions to people, you know, there's a whole issue with all of that. And, you know, but making sure to get those prescription medications right, because, you know, those prescription medications are all about regulating hormones and neurotransmitters, and you can't just pass it out willy-nilly, and you can't afford it and not let anybody have it. There are disorders, there are chemical imbalances that some people have that medication does indeed help. And there are many different, like I said, when it comes to medication, there are a lot of different factors going on there. Main thing is that key of people getting help. It's that's the tricky one, because you can't change somebody else's behavior. You can only, do the best you can, and try to set the positive example of social change. And we can't change other people's behavior because of motivation. Well, I guess we can. You have to find the motivation, and the trick there is that you have to make that person think that they have found the motivation to want to change. Because if you're just trying to tell somebody to change, you're going to have more resistance. And think about times in your life when maybe people have tried to tell you, for whatever reason, you need to change who you are, they didn't like who you are, something to that effect. And that for survival kind of kicks in, and we're like, no, we're not going to do that. So when it comes then to treating mental disorders, it can be a little trickier. But the more we empower ourselves with knowledge, the more understanding then we have for those situations, and when we encounter those types of personalities. And in the long run, that does enact some sort of change, right, guys? All right, so just real briefly, so when it comes to bipolar disorder, so once again, we're breaking down those subcategories, and we're looking at the different points on the spectrum here. So, bipolar is on the more serious side because, like I said, it's this total spiral effect because it's something that's persistent. It is going to impact everything in a person's life, where, just like the saying goes, you're spiraling out of control. And that's actually, people with bipolar disorder, that's a main phrase that they use. I feel like I'm spiraling out of control. And so, that's a good way to help, a good signal to the psychologist that they're dealing with maybe something a little bit more serious here. And then, like I said, with bipolar disorder, it's a mood state. So, you're constantly feeling this way and it's not getting better. It's just getting worse, and getting worse. That's different from those fleeting emotions. And, maybe sometimes you're sad and you got to take the weekend, eat a tub of ice cream, feel sorry for yourself, cry. That's actually normal. When that gets abnormal is when Monday comes around and you're like, nope, I'm still going to lay in bed and eat more ice cream and I'm not going to go to work and not going to shower. See a spiral effect to where it is debilitating you so that you're not normally functioning. All right. And so when we look at mood disorders and those symptoms, we've kind of really hit on a lot of those symptoms already. So we know that, that just a really intense sadness. And, if you've ever lost a loved one, you've ever lost a pet or an animal friend, you've experienced bereavement, grief. That actually is that we could put those as another subcategory of depression. Remember, it goes along a spectrum. That's kind of the low end of the spectrum there. And it's perfectly normal for us to feel a little depressed and intense sadness and lose interest when something really traumatic like death impacts our lives, right? And then, of course, if you're if you're in a really intense sad mood and you really don't have any interest in anything, that's really going to affect your other states of being, your emotions, the way you're thinking, the way you're behaving and engaging with others, and then the way that you are caring for yourself mentally and physically. And then so with depression, we have hypomania and we have mania. So it's kind of weird. So we have hypomania and mania. We'll go back and talk about those here in just a minute. Using. So when it comes to those symptoms of depression, we already just said it'll affect us emotionally, mentally, the way we act, and the way that we care for ourselves. So emotionally, we're going to see those depressed moods, that sadness, hopelessness, extreme low self-esteem, limited enthusiasm, maybe irritability, anxiety, worry. And then the cognitive one, that's what it really gets us. Our brains can be our best friends and our worst enemies at times, right? And it's that rumination when we get stuck, obsessed on that thought, too obsessed on something, and then you see obsessive compulsive disorder. So it would be possible to be obsessive compulsive with depression or a hypomanic component, right? It's that rumination. It's constantly thinking about the same topic, reviewing the same distress. Well, it's getting stuck in that negative feedback thought pattern, loop, right? It's like the broken record. You just can't get it. It's just stuck and it's going over and over. And it's just all this negative stuff that's just draining you emotionally and draining you, your energy and your spirit side of you. And so, that of course then does affect how you act in the real world. And so, that when you're in those negative feedback loops, that makes focus and concentration And then, of course, that's going to lead to those negative emotions. You're probably going to get, then anxious. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be angry. Then you can have those suicidal tendencies and intuitions start coming. And I said that wrong. Sorry, guys. And then, of course, you're drained, your brain, your emotions are drained, so that's going to drain your body. You're not going to have as much motivation. So, your hygiene and grooming is going to start to lack, I guess is a good way to say it. That's actually one of the number one like signs that something's going on with somebody, when they're not taking care, when they're not properly grooming and bathing, that's a sign that something is really going on. And then, of course, there's going to be changes with sleep and appetite, and weight can fluctuate. And then, your body is going to hurt in many ways. You may actually have reduced sexual interest and arousal. However, once again, everybody is different. And sometimes when people get in those states of mania where they have this over arousal, bipolar disorder. It's an over arousal. People can tend to engage in risky behaviors. All right, so when it comes to hypomania and mania, it's kind of weird because, hypomania makes it sound like that would be because it's hypo, you hype something up. You would think that that would be the more intense form of depression. Nope, the psychologists want to trick us and they've used that because it's a milder form. And I think it has to do something with the hippocampus. They're a part of the brain. So, with both forms, whether it's hypomania or mania, we do see, like I was just saying, arousal. So there's, increased energy, increased activity, maybe, and, personality of the person has changed a little bit. They think they are more, they're a little more narcissistic in the sense that their self-importance is more just that, more important. I'm redundant, I'll go on. We see some risk taking, and then with hypomania, people will talk excessively, and maybe they're normally kind of quiet, and even if there may be somebody that might already be a little loquacious, that excessive talk, it's going to start getting into those nonsense realms where, like they're just not making sense. They're not functioning normally. And so then with mania, it really gets stepped up, that euphoria, that arousal. Now they're in really just heightened stages of arousal of their brain, that all of those feelings and thoughts and behaviors are just confounded by like tenfold. It can be very debilitating for the first person experiencing it and for those around them, their loved ones. And so when it comes to diagnosing mental disorders, we could see like we've kind of talked about, depression, hypomania, they actually can occur without a mood disorder, along that spectrum. Once again, guys, we've got the low end, and then we've got those really high ends, and it's the high end is where it starts to become a challenge for people. And even in those heightened states of arousal, I mean, once again, life throws a lot of stimulation at us all the time, and we have these different emotional states. I would say that we're not even really properly taught how to display our emotions, and especially when it comes to the negative ones. If you're sad, if you're mad, well, don't cry, or man up, and or if you're mad, it's like, well, bottle it up, and then other people, they'll just take it out and destroy anything in their path. It's like, those show collectively that we're not being taught to deal with these emotions correctly. So we can all get in those high arousal states and be really excitable and bouncing off the wall, and we can all experience those really low states. But once again, it's when those those states become prolonged and they start impacting our livelihood and just our life in general. So looking at the severity of those symptoms plays an important role in helping to, really adequately figure out what's going on with that individual. Because, even though we have these categories and these subcategories, and we have the DSM to help guide us in helping people, we still have to remember that every individual that walks through that door that needs some kind of health care, mental health care, and they're an individual. And once again, the more we empower ourselves with knowledge and with experience, that creates the more understanding, so that you have more of that compassion, respect, and understanding, so that you as the therapist are able to make you know be more discerning, and be more um attentive and intuitive to that individuals need. So I guess I'm just, this is all just a fancy way of saying is that, we learn all of this stuff, we put it all in these categories so that we can, it helps put the piece of the puzzles to get that those pieces of the puzzle together for what is going on with that person. But at the same time, we still have to remember that person is an individual, right? So when it comes to depression, we also break those down into major depressive disorders, persistent and premenstrual hold on, see, now I can't say the word, I'm so sorry, I can't talk. Dysmorphic disorder is how you say that. All right. So when it comes to diagnosing depression, we want to, something important to note is if that person has ever experienced any hypomania or mania, because that's going to help us then narrow in on if it's actual bipolar or if it's one of the other depressive disorders. And you see, we keep stressing that idea of the severity and the chronic nature of those symptoms are how we are going to figure out which side, which part of that spectrum we're dealing with there, right? So just a summary of these, the three disorders here in a nice little chart. It gives us our DSM criteria. We got that lifetime prevalence. It shows us a little bit of gender differences, age differences there. And, I would pause. If it were me, I'd pause the video right now, and I would actually take some notes on this chart for my own, studies and doing the discussions. All right, and so when it comes to the DSM-5 guidelines, of course, they break up the disorders based on these different categories, and then there are different factors that influence these categories. And so we just see what their guidelines alerting us to be on the lookout for are these symptoms of depression. We want to see, you're looking for that impairment in functioning that is persistent. You're looking for that persistent negative mood state. And then you're going to see, changes in weight, changes in sleep, maybe even those suicidal ideations, excuse me. And then once again, just the persistent depressive disorder. It's just, you have those symptoms for a brief period. My dog is standing on the table, crazy little dog. You have those symptoms for a period of time, but after 2 years, it either improves or it changes into something a little more permanent. We also have premenstrual depression disorder, and these. This is going to be cyclic, so it's going to be something that's going to happen probably on a monthly basis at the time of menses, either right after menses or right before. Usually it's leading up to. And, we see mood changes and maybe maybe craving too much sleep, not enough sleep, social withdrawal. And then, as we have already noted, that when it comes to grief, depression can play a role there, and it's actually a normal reaction. And so, that's the thing about grief is that we live in a fast pace. Not all cultures handle grief and death and have the same type of mourning ritual. And in some cultures, it's perfectly normal to for that grief period to last for years, or maybe even up to a decade, 10 years or so. But in our culture, we're so fast paced and always a go 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 go, that we put grief into a box, right? We're like, okay, well, you just lost somebody, your wife just died from cancer. Well, you can have leave from work for 2 months, but then you got to get back to work. You better be done grieving after 2 months. You see where I'm going with that, guys? It's like here in America, we put a time stamp on everything. So we even put a timestamp on our emotions and our feelings, and as humans it just doesn't work that way. And so grief can be long lasting, but once again, there's going to be a difference when it gets that persistent, it gets chronic, it's totally debilitating. Then you get more into those DSM categories. Being a disorder is what I'm talking about. All right, and so when it comes to some of those causes, we do seem to note that a lot of it has to do with, neurotransmitters that are in. And so we all have these neurotransmitters. We all have these hormones that make up our bodies and in many ways control our emotions and our behaviors and maybe even our thinking, as some evolutionary psychologists and like biopsychologists would believe, leading us to believe that everything we do is just a chemical reaction. There's a lot of sense in that, but when it comes to things like consciousness, we don't have the chemical reaction to that. We don't have the math equation for that. Consciousness is something else. So, it's apparently not just the chemicals that are in our body and that we put in our body that controls our behavior. There is whatever this consciousness soul thing is we have plays a role in it too, right? So, because though, when we look at that biological dimension, and we'll explain this more in the next part, guys, when I go into what these actual, the multipath model. But like I said, we're taking a holistic approach. So we're looking at, the social, cultural, biological, physical, looking at all the different factors and influences, environmental and inner, that are going to affect our mental health states, right? And so neurotransmitters seem to play a big role in causing depression, things like norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. Dopamine is actually our number one feel good chemical. When it comes to life, we need water, water, food, and dopamine. That is why we have addiction. when dopamine gets too low in our bodies, we definitely tend to get more sad and depressed. When dopamine gets too high in our bodies, that's then when we go into more of these over arousal stages. And then addiction, we get addicted to things because it's a way, something is creating dopamine, be it a rush from drug or from alcohol, or be it a rush from sex or buying shoes or eating chocolate or watching TV. When we do those things, they're all creating, and then they're falsely creating dopamine because they're creating too much dopamine at one time. And, more natural ways of getting dopamine are things like out in nature, hanging out with your animals, things like meditating, painting, kind of all artsy type things. And it doesn't matter if you have a skill there or not. That's why they make those coloring books for adults now. We know just the mere act of doing something that is along our creative imaginative sides, it definitely helps calm our stress, so it lowers cortisol and helps raise our dopamine. And then depression can run in families. There's some kind of genetic connection. And then environmental factors can produce depression too. And once again, that becomes most debilitating who have both there. They already have the genetic propensity. It's actually called predisposition towards depression, because we've identified that they've got the gene for it. And so when you have something like that, and you put somebody like that and an environment that could cause that gene to activate, then that's when it gets really debilitating for people. Now, once again, at the same time, someone can have a gene for depression and get put in an environment that would produce depression, and that gene not get activated. That's the thing about it being predisposition. Just because it runs in the family, it does not mean that it's actually going to show up in every individual. Take things like psychopathy, those really, the real serious, most, less than 1% of, or less than 5% of society. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, type personalities, and worse than that, or people like Joseph Stalin and Hitler and Heinrich and all those guys, right? Haas. And what was my it doesn't, that there's actually a gene to say that might, those really heinous personalities like that it is genetic. And so there is a debate on, does that mean then if they have kids, the kids are going to grow up and be um homicidal maniacs too? And so into debates of things like abortion and birth control, and things like eugenics. So pretty interesting, when we get into psychology and we start looking at all these different aspects of what makes us as human, and how that in turn plays out in the way that we behave and engage others. It's definitely quite, just in general, it's a huge spectrum, right? All right, and like I just said, of course, when it comes to stress, things like that's where more we see the hormones, these other chemicals we have in our body. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and when we have too much of that, we can see depression, because basically, cortisol is connected to our amygdala, and the amygdala is the part of our brain that is our fight or flight response, right? That is still part of our lower kind of reptilian brain, our lower, very, very ancient part of our brain that has, hadn't evolved too much over time, because it's part of our brain that keeps us safe. That's how we stay safe and we stay alive, that amygdala kicks in those stressful situations. And at the same time, you're getting your cortisol build up. And so, some people, once again, everybody's an individual, so that can happen. And, that's going to make you more depressed. You're going to feel more anxious and stressed out. But then, you also have, that's why it's called flight or fight reaction, because arousal of the amygdala, that overproduction of cortisol then induces that adrenaline, and you're in the fight stage of it, right? All right. So what we see with depression is that actually there's a lot of what we say increased connectivity. Basically, it's almost like those neural connections in the brain are a little bit, think of a circuit board, and it's kind of there's definitely something wonky going on because all the lights are dipping up or lighting up and in weird patterns that's not the normal pattern. And so antidepressant medications will help normalize it, so then that pattern of that neural pattern, those neural connections, they start flowing again then in that normal way supposed to. And then the hippocampus plays a big function, and then a lot of the synapses. And so once again, that's just a fancy way of saying that those connections, the synapses are on the neurotransmitters. Those are what um, connect the neurotransmitters to each other so that the messages are being to the brain. They're being transmitted to parts of the body. And so, see a disconnect there, then something in the brain, kind of the brain's way of saying, it's help. And it's pretty cool that we developed the technology to be able to show us that. It's like brain scans, MRIs, and all those other things. I think those are really cool, right? So when it comes to the psychological depression, we're seeing those behavioral explanations. So, what causes depression is basically what we're talking about here. And so we see, aside a logical um, explanation, we have now the environmental side of it. So, positive reinforcement, positive social reinforcement. It seems when we don't get those, it tends to make people sad and unhappy. And this is, of course, is going to be affect. This is going to affect somebody's social skills, their behavior, and then, of course, the way we think. Once again, getting stuck in those negative feedback loops, thinking and dwelling, ruminating on those negative things that have happened is definitely going to cause us to feel sad. And, it's especially a risk, and especially teenage girls, because, what I just said, at adolescence, our brains are still developing all our neurotransmitters, those neural connections, the hormones, they're all still developed. So, it causes us to, causes our brain is, and our actions and all of that is in a constant state during adolescence. So, brains really, our transmitters really do control us during that stage of life. And so, it's definitely important that we identify those depressive signs in young ones, right? And there's been a high a level of the LGBTQ plus community among adolescents, teenagers, and depression and suicide. So once again, it's important to identify those symptoms in younger generations. And then sometimes depression, we could say that maybe helplessness, so kind of theories behind it, and basically learned helplessness. I hate this experiment. Martin Siegel, the guy who started positive psychology, ironically, did these experiments back in the 70s when it was pretty much okay to do experiments with animals and like do mean things to them. And what they did was they locked these dogs up in this cage in these cages to where they couldn't get out and electrocuted them just to see what they were going to do, see what they how the dogs were going to learn to get out of the situation. What were the dogs going to do? Well, the dogs, after struggling, realized that they couldn't get out. So what do dogs do when they realize they're helpless to their situation? They pretty just they give up. They just lay down. So the dogs would just lay there and let them electrocute them. And I'm like, that is so oh, horrible. It makes me not like positive psychology. Every time now when I talk about positive psychology, I'm like disgusting. But anyway, so so they can call this an actual learning condition called learned helplessness because even they did that so much to those poor dogs that I think they might actually have took them out and put them in a cage where they could get out, but the dogs were so used to being tied down and shocked that they still just lay there and totally screwed those dogs up mentally, right? And but what we supposedly have learned from that is that as human beings, we give up at times, and so that is a factor for domestic abuse. There's learned helplessness involved in that, and other than mental and emotional stuff going on there. Um, and then negative attribution styles. And basically, what that means is, once again, those negative feedback loops, putting our focus and our energy on things that are just not serving to our greater good and self interest, right? And then when it comes to those negative thinking patterns, getting out of those negative feedback loops could be hard. We all have the shadow side of our unconscious brain that plays a role in our behavior. It plays a role in our personalities, and then, of course, how we engage others and we see our place in the world and how that compares to other people. And as we have already said, some of that, of course, is genetic. It definitely has some environmental influence. So, especially during those childhood development years, those early years there, if there's not a positive regard, a positive system punishment, then there's going to be some kind of maladjustment to adulthood. And then, when it comes to how we were treated during childhood, if there was any kind of abuse, and that's going to bring up all sorts of these guilty and shameful emotions. That's going to lead us into those negative thinking patterns and feedback loop. All right, guys. So that ends this part of our lecture on just what are mental disorders and looking at some of those causes of them. And so in our next lecture, we are going to look at how we go about treating mental disorders. And I believe we're going to talk a little bit more about bipolar disorder. So, all right. Thanks, guys.